Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, it's gonna be something a little bit different. I'm here helping my buddy Charles from Umamicue. He's a bit busy right now, trying to get ready for service for today and just kind of worrying about a bunch of other stuff that you have to worry about as a business owner. He called me the other day and asked me if I can come and help cook some briskets for him. And it's been a while since I've been able to do a larger cook, so I decided let's help a buddy out and let's get some practice in cooking some briskets. So before we talk any further, let's hurry up and get the fire started, get the briskets seasoned, and get them on the smoker before we continue on with this video. Guys, we almost forgot one of the most important steps. Alright guys, so we got the fire started, we got the brisket seasoned up, we got the briskets on. We also took some of the mohawk and that decal fat Charles uses it for. He turns into basically chopped brisket and puts it in his egg rolls. So we're just gonna smoke those off as well. Originally just gonna put all those kind of end pieces towards the back while I can keep the briskets up front where it's a little bit hotter. While I was seasoning up those briskets, I just realized how big they were and they just needed a little bit more space. So I decided to squeeze all the briskets all the way back, kind of put like the mohawks up the front. I was a little bit worried that that front side might be a little bit too hot. Everything is going to start to shrink a little bit, so it'll kind of create more space. Yeah, I think we should be okay. Start the smoker at 250 for the first 3 hours, and then around the 3 to 4 hour mark, that'll kind of give me an indication of how hot 250 actually is on this pit. If it's starting to look a little bit dark and it's tightening up just a little bit, I think we picked a safe temperature. If the surface is really dry, we got the edges getting a little bit darker than the rest of the brisket, 250 might be a little bit too hot, but I don't think that's going to be the case. Later on, it'll help us to kind of figure out at what stage in the cook that we can afford to bump the temps up to about like 270, 275 to kind of, you know, push the cook a little bit more, render out more fat, pull out more moisture out of that brisket as we go. Alright guys, so it's about an hour and a half right now, and usually I do a check around 3 hours, but just because this is a pit that I haven't cooked on very much, and there are a couple small differences that if I want to make sure that how my typical brisket cooks end up the same way that I want to, there's just a couple things I need to keep in mind. One being because the rub is just a seasoning salt and black pepper, the kind of texture on the outside is just a little bit different. It's because it's a lot powderier, and if it dries up a little bit too fast or there's too much convection on top, the top can look a little patchy and a little dry. As you guys saw, I spritzed the top of the brisket with a little bit of water. I say in a lot of my videos, you know, I don't always spritz if I don't have to, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's a necessity to do so just based off of how your briskets are looking. And then the top of the briskets that I saw were looking a little bit patchy and a little bit dry in certain spots, especially the ones up front that are kind of getting a little bit more heat. Gonna bring this heat down just a little bit. Right now, with our briskets being quite large and us having 9 of them in there, I'm gonna wait for them to shrink up just a little bit more so we can create a little bit more space so I can feel a little bit more confident in bringing the temp up just a little bit more. we are at the 3-hour mark. A couple things that I want to do in this situation, like I mentioned before, the briskets were quite large, so we're waiting them to shrink up, and they did. So instead of having 3x3, we have 3 briskets all in the back, 4 in the middle, and then 2 that we turn sideways. Now we've got a lot more space to work with, and you know, I don't have any briskets like really close to the fire back there. And how I decided to choose those 2 briskets that go in the front are ones that have a little more fat coverage. That side where you start slicing those burn end chunks. This is something that people played around with a lot, you know, back in the day. Instead of having briskets being, you know, 4 rows, sometimes they would 2 going perpendicular across. But really for me, it's like, 1, I'm trying to save space, and 2 is because those sides have a little bit more fat on there, that's like kind of gets a little more rendered than other pieces do. But that's also why it's, again, really important that when you're trimming briskets, you're kind of keeping in mind how these things are going to cook. You can have briskets that have thicker fat caps, but something that you have to be conscious of is at some point during the cook, you have to cook hot enough to start rendering on that fat. In this situation, it's not necessarily that I'm cooking hotter, it's just I'm putting in a spot to where it's cooking hotter than the back, and so hopefully that will kind of end up catching up with the rest of the briskets towards the, you know, end of the cook or when we're getting ready to wrap. Another thing that I'm just paying attention to, you know, in terms of temps, I think our temps are pretty good. This is an insulated firebox. The draw is pretty good. It's cooking a little bit hotter than I would expect it to, reading the temperatures. That's fine. I mean, then I would just say I'm gonna keep this temperature at this 250 range. And with all this rotation that you guys saw me do, is it something that you have to do? Not really. You know, I always call it spot rotation. For the briskets that were up front and they needed to be pushed back just because those points were really close to fire for, you know, last 3 hours, those I wanted to move towards the back. And then again, finding those bigger briskets that we can turn, that have a thicker fat cap, that need more rendering, those went up to the front. And the way that I set this up, doing the 3, 4, and 2, do you have to do it that way? Absolutely not. It's just like at this point, honestly, sometimes I get really bored of cooking brisket sometimes, and I just kind of like playing around with it just to see like how it's gonna cook. You're just stirring a little curveball in there and seeing how you adapt to the cook, or see how your smoker adapts to that change. And then later on, as you start to cook more and more, you start to understand how briskets cook. You also understand how the smoker is going to react to your changes, and that's when you and your smoker become really good friends and you start to figure out your own tendencies. I'm gonna probably let this roll for another 5 or 6 hours. And at that point, we'll see if we need another rotation. We'll see if our briskets are still getting dried out in the surface. Right now, they look pretty good. I think it needed that initial sweat to kind of get that surface to be a little bit wet. I did spritz it again. The way that this thing is cooking right now, it feels like it needs a little bit more moisture. That's it for right now, and we'll let this roll for a couple more hours, and I'll see you guys in a little bit. Never know what kind of weather you're gonna run into cooking in Chicago, so I'm gonna hide in my car for a little bit until this rain passes. Alright guys, so we're about the 7-8 hour mark into this cook right now, and our briskets are looking really good. They've gotten a lot darker since the last time we checked them. Their surfaces are starting to look really moist. There is a little bit of pooling on top, but it's perfectly fine. That's normal. All the briskets right now are in between like 170, and some of the ones that are up front are a little past 175. Now at this point, the internal temps are slowly getting to where we want them to be. You know, I kind of want them to be above 175, close to 180. Also, like, we want that fat and top to be rendered, and that part is still not there. So this is a stage, if you guys decide to wrap in butcher paper, like, this is kind of a very important step where you want to make sure you render all that fat really well before you get in the paper, because you don't want all that rendering happening while it's in the paper. In my opinion, it adds too much humidity. Your bark starts to wash off a little bit. But just like any other cook, like, all my information is exactly the same as I always say, because brisket cooks in general are pretty much the same. Like, there's different variables that you're working with: the wood, the shape of your briskets, the weather, the environment that we're cooking in. We're cooking in the middle of warehouses right now where it's super loud. You know what? At the end of the day, it's still cooking brisket. Spent about 45 minutes, close to an hour or so since the last check. Our briskets are almost ready to go. You can see right now the fat on top is a little bit softer. It's starting to get that really nice, super cushiony fat on top, while it was pretty hard around the 5-6 hour mark. Just because I think it needs a little bit more heat. We're gonna bump up that heat up to about 285, 300 or so. The next like 15-20 more minutes or so. In the meantime, we're gonna go inside and rip some butcher paper to wrap these briskets up. Alright guys, so it's been about an hour and a half since the briskets have been wrapped, and some of them are definitely ready to come off. Before it goes into wrap, one thing that we're looking for is for that fat to be rendered up top. I want to try to feel for the finishing of the brisket. I'm actually feeling for the bottom of it. So I'm feeling for how loose that lean end is going to be. And when I like to check them, I like to flip them over so the lean side is on top, and I'm using my thumbs to kind of feel for how soft it is all the way across. And you know, feeling for a brisket is kind of hard to explain sometimes, but I think as time has gone on, the one cue I'd always tell people is you want your bottom, your lean to feel almost like a memory foam pillow. You're feeling for this bouncy softness. You don't want to be able to jam your thumb through it, but there is this really nice softness, but it kind of bounces back. And there are certain spots that might be tighter than others. Sometimes it can be on the edges, sometimes it can be right in the center of the lean. The goal is to really be able to make sure that we have an even texture all the way through. And that's why I don't pull briskets off by temp, because it varies what temp it's gonna come off. And that's why I always go by feel, because it can be anywhere between, you know, the famous 203 and it can go up to about 215 or so. But the other thing that you have to consider is if the point is pretty much already done and there's not that much more it can take, or it feels like it's getting really too soft, those are the times where I'll pull them even though the lean doesn't feel exactly the way I want. I only say that because sometimes the lean just kind of doesn't catch up, and if your points are already too far gone, or if they cook too fast in the beginning, you might just end up with an overcooked point and an undercooked lean, because a lean might not catch up to it. And also, it's just a really good way to go through your briskets and check them quickly without having to overanalyze every single brisket, because if you do so, and let's say you're doing a lot of briskets for a pop-up or something like that, it's just going to take you forever to check these briskets, which is going to stall the cook if they're not ready. And so it's just a much faster way to just go in there, flip the brisket over, press it with your thumbs, and move on to the next one. Alright guys, so we pull out some of these briskets, gonna let them cool down, and then Charles is gonna pick them up later, and they'll be ready to serve tomorrow at Umamicue. Alright guys, so it is the next day. We're gonna head over to Spilt Milk, which is the bar where Umamicue is. We're gonna cut into some of those briskets and take a look at some of the food there.
Rice paper, real expensive. We got a pro cooking this today. Yeah. Whew.
How'd we do?
I think we did really well.
All right.
Nice and tender. Yep. Some cilantro.